Well, hey, everybody, welcome. We are so glad that you are joining us, whether you're here in the room with us or you're joining us online. So appreciate you joining us as we finish our series, Christianish, where we talk about this shift that can happen where we go from growing in faith to playing it safe. And it's just an easy thing to let happen in our lives if we're not careful. And so we've been talking over the last few weeks about these rhythms of a better life, not easier, but better, where we invite Jesus into the everyday. And so the one that we're going to talk about this week, we've actually been setting up for a while. And so if you're new or this is your first weekend joining us, I want to make sure you don't feel pressured by this, but we're going to talk about generosity a little bit today because it's a really important topic as we're going to discover together. And so if you are a follower of Jesus and you call Eastern Hills home, I'm going to be asking you to do some very specific stuff as we kind of continue on in our service and finish up. And really what that's about is a 40-day generosity challenge. And so in your program, if you're here with us in the room, you have a card like this. And if you are watching online and you want to see the same thing, you can go to ehills.org/challenge. The back of your card explains this right here. We know that for a lot of people, it's just a really difficult thing to think about. What does it mean to engage in financial generosity? What does it mean to give? And why is that important? And so we've tried to just help set up ways that you can kind of step along the way. And so potential really comes from this agricultural concept that we read about in the Bible, that if we sow sparingly, if we plant few seeds, we will reap sparingly. We will have a small harvest in our lives. And it doesn't mean that we're like a prosperity church. We don't think that if you give $1, God will give you $10. It's not any of that stuff. It just means that there is a direct connection to my heart, my faith, and my finances, as we're going to discover together. And so for some of you, the step that you're going to take is to begin giving something, to begin sowing some seed of generosity into what God is doing here. The next one we talk about is the step of priority, which is this principle of God getting the first fruits, not God getting our leftovers, but God getting the very best. And the way we often do that around here is through automating gifts, that when you get paid, God receives your gift. And then the third one is a growing percentage. For most of the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, the Bible as a whole, what we see is actually this thing called a tithe, and it's 10%. And for you, that may feel just completely insurmountable. And so for you, maybe the percentage that God's going to challenge you to take a step in is 2% or 3% or something that grows over time. And then partnership is the step where you would take and go, you know what, I'm going to give above and beyond a percentage, not just for what Eastern Hills needs today or for what God's going to do in this place today, but for many days, many years to come. We're in a room like this, in a place like this, because men and women of faith for decades have partnered to see the kingdom of heaven be made known here in Southeast Aurora and around the world. The other piece of paper that you have in your program is a little card that like this, and it says, I'm taking the challenge on one side. On the other side, it asks for your name and your email and what step you want to take. And at the end of our services, we're going to sing a song together. You can do this at that same website if you're watching online. But if you're here with us in the room, I'd love for you to fill out your name, fill out your email, and hopefully you've been thinking about this and maybe praying about what God's calling you to do to join us in this 40 days between now and when we celebrate Easter together, a time when we often give something up. I think that this kind of a sacrifice may make a much bigger difference in your life and faith. And so it may be one of those steps right now you just instantly know what that step is that God's challenging you to take. You've been automating your giving, but it's been a really small amount. You've been kind of tipping God. You haven't really been feeling it. And he's calling you to ask about a percentage that you could give away. So I hope that whatever that is, at the end, you can take a step as an individual or a family to be able to do that. So I just want to let you know that's coming. Before we get started, I'm going to pray for us. And if you've never been here before or never heard me speak, I pray kneeling. And the reason that I do that is because God gives grace to the humble, but he opposes the proud. And I know that these are extremely difficult conversations. And I know that for lots of us, they're kind of the things that Jesus gets the last little bit of in our life. We just don't even really want to talk about it. And so right now, let's just together humble ourselves before God and ask him to pour grace into our lives, into our minds, into our hearts, that we could see the way he wants us to live our lives today. Would you pray with me? God, thank you. Thank you that for all of us, we walk in here with titles, we walk in here with expectations, we walk in here with accomplishments. But the great equalizer in this room is that there is simply nothing we can do to earn your love, that you have given it to all of us, universally. And when we realize that, God, it should humble us. I pray that it would right now. that God, you would remind us of how much you love us and how little we deserve it. Would you help us now as we consider what it means to respond in faithfulness, to listen to your Spirit? In Jesus' name, amen. So every week we've been looking at a cultural statement that, well, you don't say the statement, I'm guessing you have heard it or you've felt it as this kind of idea. And so the one we're looking at this week is the statement, get yours, which is a statement that, again, maybe you've never said it before, but the underlying value is that the hope that we kind of have in our culture is that the more you get, the better you are. The more you can accumulate, the more money you can get, the bigger the house you can get, the better the family you can get, the higher the job you can get, all those things, just more. And we're not really thinking about what we give, we're just thinking about what we get. And if you've known people like that in your life, or maybe you've been that person, somewhere along the way, I'm guessing that you can point to a moment where you're like, you know what? Actually, that didn't work out very well for me, or it didn't work out very well for them. The hope, the satisfaction, the contentment that I thought it would bring, or that they thought it would bring, it didn't bring. On the flip side, who is the most selfless person you know? I'm guessing that they're not the person that says, at least not seriously, get yours, but there's somebody in your life that's probably pretty selfless that you can think of. And how do you know that they're selfless? That you're not thinking, you know how I know this person's selfless? Is because they say all the time, they're like, I am selfless, right? Like, that is what we call a red flag, you know? They're not like, I don't know, you've met a lot of people, but I'm the most humble one that you've met, I'm sure of it. It's not those people. The people that you know that are the most selfless, the people that you know that are the most generous, my guess is that nobody would know that they are, because they don't do that to be noticed. They don't do that to be known by other people. They have inside of them this awareness of how much they've been blessed, and somewhere along the way, they've realized that they've been blessed to be a blessing, and that's true for all of us. And so when we kind of take a step back, one of the reasons that this is so important is because of how often Jesus talks about this. The reason that we're talking about it, the reason we're having you turn in papers and we're saying together, let's see what God can do, is because this is what Jesus says. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I know it's easy for lots of us to kind of think about faith or to engage in it a little bit, and the last thing that God gets access to is our finances, is our wallet. And it feels like, God, I'm in, I love you, I'm gonna worship you, I wanna learn more about you, but like I'm just not ready to give you that yet. And what Jesus is saying is like, I'm totally okay with wherever you are. Just keep walking towards me, and until I have your treasure, I don't have your heart. Jesus is saying that wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is. And the great news is that's not just prescriptive, it's not just descriptive, it's also prescriptive. It allows you and me to change how we think about and manage our finances, to move our heart closer to God. As a matter of fact, that's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes together. That generosity is our faith's lie detector test. You can say a lot of things about your faith. I can say a lot of things about my faith, but your generosity does not lie. It is a ceiling for so many of us. And what we're going to discover, we're going to look at 3 different types of faith. 2 of them are kind of right in line with where we've been studying, and then the third one is a way to really maybe make a pivot or make a shift in your life. The first type of faith that we're going to talk about is counterfeit faith. If you've been with us for the last few weeks, we've been in this letter called 2 Timothy, written by the Apostle Paul, kind of sent one leader in the first century. He's a church planter. He invests in other pastors. One of them is a young pastor named Timothy. And Paul is writing to Timothy from prison, awaiting his own execution. And as he writes these words to Timothy, he's trying to help him understand this is what it means for you to follow Jesus and to do it the way that will help you and people around you. And if you were with us last week, he talked about, okay, Timothy, if you're dealing with difficult people and difficult conversations, this is the way you do it. He said, here's some stuff you need to run from in your life. Here's some stuff you need to embrace in your life. And then when you show up to the conflict well, here are the ways that you can have the conversation in the best possible way, in hopes that that person's heart may change, because that person actually isn't your enemy. That person is being used by the enemy of our soul. See, we don't have a battle against flesh and blood. We have a battle against powers and principalities, forces of evil. Like there is this battle we can't see. And so the hope is that when you and I show up in difficult relationships and we show up the way that Paul tells Timothy to show up, that God can use it. But this week, as we roll into chapter 3, he talks about this group. He says, look, it's not always going to end that way. It's not always going to be that things work out. And so in describing this kind of faith, Paul says this to Timothy. He says, but understand this, that in the last days, there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents. This may seem like a strange thing for us to highlight in 2020, but if you can imagine it, 2,000 years ago, this was like the bare minimum. The idea was like, if you can't respect your parents, who could you possibly respect? That was kind of the idea. Things have changed a little, right? Ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable. This is kind of this idea that like somebody that you're in conflict with, there's literally nothing that can make them happy. Like it's just the spot that they're in right now. Slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous. This is the idea of traitor, like someone you thought you knew, but it turned out you didn't. Reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Paul says to Timothy, avoid such people. Now, where we were last week, Paul was trying to help Timothy figure out how to show up and deal with difficult people in difficult conversations in hopes of kind of winning them over, seeing hearts change, seeing unity pursued. But now he gives 19 characteristics that he says, here are some things you need to be careful of. And here's the problem. If we're honest, none of us are clean on this. Like none of us look at that list of 19 things and go like, never struggled with any of them, right? I mean, you've at least struggled with pride because you just did. Like, we all struggle with some of these. Like it's just the human condition. But what Paul is really telling Timothy is that there's this trajectory we have to be worried about. This trajectory that when knowing enough is my priority, it is so easy for me to rationalize how I show up in relationships. That if I think I have the right message, it doesn't matter the way I deliver it. But that's just not true. And so he gets to this end point that I think is, man, it's hard. Like I can't think of a worse way to be described or to describe someone else. He says they have the appearance of godliness, but they're denying its power. They look the part. They know the words to say. But Paul, in writing to the Romans, he says that the gospel, this message of hope and life through Jesus, is not just about someday, one day in heaven. It's the power of God to change you and me. And when you and I settle for the appearance, but we don't let God in, this is the trajectory that our life goes down. Not one or two of these things that we pull back and apologize from, but all these things we just lean into and we rationalize over and over and over again. And it is so important for us to take a step back and remember that Paul is not talking about your non-Christian friend. He's not talking about the neighbor that's like, completely off the rails, wants nothing to do with God. He's talking about us. He's talking about the church. He's talking about Christians. He's saying that there's going to come a time where they look the part, but they don't actually live the part. And I think what's so hard for us is that it can look so good. I don't know if you've ever seen a $100 bill, but when I look at a $100 bill, I feel like the designer just was given too much license. Like it just looks crazy to me, you know? And you may already know this, but those features are not some designer that was having fun in Photoshop. Those features are there to help combat counterfeit currency. Almost everything that you see on a $100 bill exists so that when it's a fake $100 bill, they can detect it. Things like color shifting ink, watermarks, a raised print, security strip, even that ultraviolet glow that it does where they put it underneath the light when you hand it to somebody. All those things are put in place for the sake of detecting counterfeit. And you know, the problem is that for most of us, when we're given money, it goes from our hand to our wallet and then from our wallet to somebody else. We interact with that currency for 10 seconds. We just don't even think about it. And so it's easy for this currency to the untrained eye, or when you just look at it very quickly, to pass from person to person to person. And I think sometimes faith can be like that too. That there are people in our life that we just haven't looked close enough at. And so they just have one little thing kind of just off. And Paul's saying like the trajectory of that's going to go really bad. the trajectory of that's going to get really poisonous, going to get really angry, going to get really hateful. And maybe, if I can get in your business for a minute, maybe this is you. Maybe this isn't about somebody in your life. Maybe as you look inward at your own faith right now, this is describing you. The great news of the gospel is that it's never too late, that there's always hope, that there's always an opportunity to turn back. But Paul is not talking about somebody we get to distance ourselves from. He's saying, Timothy, these people are within the church. These people could be us. And so for us to stay on guard, to stay aware, Paul's already told us that it's so important for us to stay aware of how dangerous and damaging these conversations, this gossip, this slander, how dangerous the controversy can be. Earlier on in this same book, a few weeks ago, he described it as gangrene. It spreads like gangrene. And I'm guessing that most of us, we don't think about gangrene very much. It doesn't feel like a very big threat. So when Paul describes it that way, you hear that, but you think I'm not sure that would affect me that way, Paul. I'm not sure that would affect my life that way. This is a really juicy rumor. I can just lean into it. Yeah, I know this is coming at me in a really inappropriate way, but it's fine. It won't hurt me because you don't think about gangrene that way. But we're finding ourselves at a moment where if his language had been coronavirus, I feel like your response would be different. I feel like if all of a sudden you knew where a hot pocket was of coronavirus, you wouldn't be like, you know what, today, without any protective gear, let's just drive there and shake some people's hands. We're not doing that because we understand the risk. But when Paul says this kind of talk and letting this stuff go unchecked and unaddressed, it's the same thing. So we have to take a step back and understand that talk is cheap. If you want to know what really matters in your heart, if you want to really know what matters in your life, generosity is your faith's lie detector test. It's the thing that really says what's true underneath the hood for you and me as it relates to our faith. And what he's about to talk to us about is that counterfeit faith actually can't be contained. So if that's true for you or for somebody that you know or you've watched it or experienced it in the past, that counterfeit faith cannot be contained. It always becomes leaking faith. If you don't address it, it will start leaking. It'll start leaking on people around you. It'll start leaking in relationships. It will create damage in your life. Paul describes it this way to Timothy. He says, "For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses," just a Bible minute for you. These two names were actually handed down through church tradition. These were never in the Hebrew scriptures where this story originally came up. These two people opposed Moses as God was trying to use Moses to deliver his people from Egyptian captivity. And they tried to say they had the same power that Moses had, but without the God of the Bible. And spoiler alert, did not go well for them, okay? So these men also opposed the truth, men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. But they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men. Paul is saying, look, Timothy, here's what I want you to know. This is a really challenging group of people, and I know you're going to want to get in there and mix it up with them, but I'm telling you, it has more negative effect than you realize. And here's what's going to happen. Their counterfeit faith is going to begin to show itself. It's going to start leaking. And one of the ways it's going to start leaking, he gives one really awful example, right? One really awful example that's a part of this bigger category, that when we start getting off kilter, whether it's something about what we believe, whether it's our approach to how we have conversations, whether it's something true in our life and the way that we're making moral choices, what will happen over time is that we'll take other easily manipulated, influenced people with us. We will take them down with us. And then Paul, he uses this phrase that feels kind of similar, right? He said, they have this appearance of godliness, but they deny its power. Here he says, here's the thing, they will keep on learning, but never come to a knowledge of the truth. Doesn't that just feel awful? Saying they'll have lots of information, they'll have tons of ideas, they'll have all the right words, they'll be super informed, but they'll never get the point. And he's saying you don't really have to chase it down too much, because eventually they're not going to get very far. It's going to be pretty easy to see that this is what's happening in and through their life that their counterfeit faith is leaking. And here's the hard part for lots of us to think about, right? Maybe for you, you're somebody that's learned a whole bunch of information for a really long time. But this idea of like, what has that happened for you? You don't want to be the person where you've learned lots of information, but you've never come to a knowledge of the truth. Here's my caution to you. Information without transformation creates pride, and God opposes the proud. Paul describes this as knowledge puffs up. When I just have knowledge and all I do is just learn more, and I never give access to the Holy Spirit of God living inside of me, if I'm a follower of Jesus, to change my life because of that information is actually hurting me because it's just making me more and more proud. I get it better than you do. I sort of deserve this more than you do. I get to step higher than you do. That is a dangerous path to go on, and it will eventually leak. Have you ever bought a used car that you didn't have checked out before? If you haven't, don't. I'll just save that for you. I did it one time. I bought a car that was used and I didn't have it checked out beforehand. The guy that was selling it to me, I was young, he told me that it ran great. So I just figured, this guy seems trustworthy. It's gonna be great. It was not great. And what I noticed over the first few days of driving it is every time I drove away from somewhere, like my car had left just a gift on the ground underneath wherever it was. And if you know anything about cars, like that's a bad sign, right? And the longer you let a leak like that go, two things happen. The more damage is caused, and the more it's going to cost to fix it. And that's not just true of cars, that's true of our lives. The longer we let this counterfeit faith go in our life or with people that we're close to, the more it will leak and the more damage it will cause and the more expensive it will be in every category to repair. So how do we figure that out, right? How do we take a step back? Well, generosity is at the core of it because it's the lie detector test for your faith. But it's not just descriptive. It's not just this is something that is, it's something that could be. There's a possibility for your life to actually change, and that's what we're gonna look at next. We looked at counterfeit faith, and we talked about how that led to leaking faith, but there's this eternal faith that Paul's gonna talk to Timothy about. We've been in 2 Timothy for the last few weeks, and 2 Timothy is this letter that's so personal, right? Paul's writing it from prison, waiting for his own execution. It's kind of his final words to this young pastor, Timothy. He wants Timothy to understand how he can live different, how he can lead different. But he wrote another letter that we have in the New Testament as well, and that letter is 1 Timothy. And that letter's a little bit different. This one's a little bit more like, how do you set up church? How do you approach organization? How do you think about and lead and love people as a pastor, right? And in the last chapter of 1 Timothy, Paul has something that I think is very, very important for us as we reflect on our own faith. He says this, he says, as for the rich in this present age, and just an aside, that's all of us. That's not just globally, that's historically. Like we are this group. He's talking to us. Charge them not to be haughty, prideful, because God opposes the proud, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Paul's like, Timothy, you got to get this, man. Here's the thing. There are people in your church, and their natural inclination is that their confidence in who they are and the security of what they have is going to be in the uncertainty of riches in this world. Now, as we hear that, probably most of the time we think, well, I'm not sure I'd qualify as rich. That doesn't feel like me, maybe, compared to your neighbor, somebody down the street. Or maybe you think like, you know what, I get it that sometimes riches can be uncertain, but like we're doing okay right now. It doesn't necessarily always feel emotional, but really today we have a chance to feel it in a way that is quite a bit different, right? Because of the coronavirus, in large part, over the last week, the Dow Jones stock market dropped 11.5%, 3,583 points. It's the largest drop in over a decade. It lost nearly $3.6 trillion in value in a week. And Paul is not saying money's bad. He's not saying that you and I like should be hermits that live in the middle of nowhere. He's just saying, like, if you want something that really lasts, if you want to say, this is who I am and this is what matters most to me, he's saying, don't make it the uncertainty of riches. Make it the blessings and the provision and the way God has shown up in your life. Not just for today, but for eternity. And even if this world and its riches become more uncertain for you, you can say, I have a greater foundation because of what God has done for me in Jesus, because of the hope and the peace and the joy that I get every day, regardless of my circumstances. That is better. And really, he gives Timothy this list to be able to give to the rich people that he's talking to in his church. And the list is this. He says, number one, you should do good. This is a universal idea for all Christians. You may not know this, but when you are saved, if you decided to follow Jesus with your life, it actually says that you are saved with good works already in mind for you to do, that before the foundation of the world, God set up the good works that you would do. God placed you in exactly the home, exactly the neighborhood, exactly the school, exactly at the job that you're in right now to be able to make a difference. And he says, for the rich people, don't let that be enough that they just do good. If they want to be rich, here's what they should be rich in. They should be rich in good deeds. That's the account they should be thinking about if they want to make deposits that matter. Then he says, be generous and ready to share. Look, I know that for a lot of us, it's easy to keep score in our head. Maybe it's easy to compare to somebody else. It's easy to go, I've been generous at times, or I've done something for somebody at times, but I'm not sure if anybody's going to notice it if I do it this time. This message is still for you and me today, that we should be eager, we should be ready to share, to be generous, to be rich in good deeds, that we should be looking to do good in the world around us. Because here's the thing, this is not about the prosperity gospel. This is not like if you give this much, God will give you this much. That's not what's happening. We give because we've been given. We are blessed so that we can be a blessing. It's really about which kingdom you're going to invest in. See, there's the kingdom of this world, and that kingdom will eventually fail us all. That kingdom continues to deteriorate. That kingdom continues to move away from the will and the words that God has preserved for us. And then there's the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is up and to the right forever. It doesn't matter what's looking like things are happening around this world. The kingdom of heaven is established and isn't going anywhere. So Paul would tell us, are you investing in the right kingdom? Whose kingdom are you investing in today? I know that over the last few weeks, there's been plenty of rhythms that have maybe been difficult for you to think about or to make space in your time and your calendar for, because it's just been easy. It's been easy for other things to crowd them out. It's been easy for other things to take them over. And I'm telling you, I know that the money one is really difficult, but I'm also telling you, it's the one that's the ceiling. If you don't do this, you can say anything you want, but talk is cheap. It's really about developing ongoing habits of generosity and service. That in a world that says, get yours, God says, give mine. And that's why we talk about these generous life stages, because I know that they are difficult. I know that for you, if you've never given before, maybe you've taken a step somewhere, you've experienced something, you've given a little bit, or you've automated something, but you don't really feel it. And the step that you feel like God's gonna ask you to take over the next few minutes is a challenging step, but it's a step for your heart. He's saying, would you just move your heart towards me? Last month, I spent some time in Guatemala, and I met a little girl named Naomi. And Naomi is this amazing little girl who has met Jesus, and it has not made her life easier. Her life is not easy, but it has made her life better, so much better. Not just her, but her family. And I got to spend time and have a meal with her, and then after lunch, the translator left, and it was just the two of us, and we go into this little library. And she wanted me to read this book that was in Spanish, and I don't speak Spanish or read Spanish, so of course my pronunciation was incredible. And so as I read this book, every time I happened to get a word right, she would go, sí, and she'd clap for me. And every time that I got a word wrong, she would hit me and correct me. I think she might become a teacher, that's my guess. But Jesus is making your life better, not easier, but better. And not just for her, but for her family and for her community, it's changing. I also met a little girl down there named Caitlin, and She's so special to us because our family sponsors her. And it's the first time I've had a chance to meet her face to face, and it was incredible. And her story is so similar that Jesus has not made her life easier, but so much better. And not just for her, but for her family and for her community. And you may not know this, but when you're generous at Eastern Hills, you support kids just like these all the way around the world. As a matter of fact, there are 105 kids in Zambia where their food, their shelter, their education, all of it is provided because of your generosity. And it's not just about stuff that happens around the world or in North Aurora or in downtown Denver. This picture is of a young man named Chance, and Chance connected with us through our middle school ministry. And Chance began to experience something that we say all the time, right? Things that he hadn't before. This connection to God that was so helpful and so different. And it wasn't enough for him to just experience it for himself. He told his family about it. So as he shared it with his family, his mom, who'd been a follower of Jesus for years, but had a hard time connecting the rest of them into it, the whole family came here, and the whole family experienced change and hope in this place like they hadn't before. As a matter of fact, Chance's sister is on our staff now. Chance's mom prays in our prayer room after services, helps you through your pain, even as she processes out of her own pain. This is so important because over time, you and I have to realize, like, we've been blessed to be a blessing. Next weekend, we're going to celebrate a baptism service. And if you've never been here for one, you just can't miss it. It's incredible to watch people make personal faith public. We had 2 baptism services this fall, and we watched 97 people make their faith public. And it was unbelievable. I don't know what's going to happen next week, but I'm telling you, that's the kingdom I want to invest in. That's the kingdom I want you to invest in. That's where I want my foundation to be. That's where I want your foundation to be. And so in just a minute, as we sing a song together, I want you to take that piece of paper. If you call Eastern Hills home, and I want you to write your name on it, your email on it. And as you look at those steps we've talked about, potential, priority, percentage, and partnership, what is the step over the next 40 days that God is asking you to take? And during that song, at any time, you just bring it to one of the boxes around the room. But before you do that, I want to share this story. It's kind of a classic. I'm sure you've heard it before. It goes like this. An old man is talking to his son. He says, "A fight is going on inside me. It's a terrible fight between 2 wolves. One wolf is evil. He is angry, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, pride, superiority, and ego. The other wolf is good. He's joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on in you." As he finished, the little boy asked his dad, "Which wolf wins?" The father catches his breath and he says, "The one you feed." Over the next few minutes, Eastern Hills, as you come to these boxes, which wolf will you feed? Which kingdom will we invest in together? Can I pray for you? God, I know that in a room like this, with people watching online, it is just so hard to know where we're all coming from, God. But would you remind us of this truth, God, that wherever our treasure is, that's where our heart really is? Not where we say, not where we fake it. You know, God, you know where our heart really is right now. Would you speak to us? God, would you correct some of those things on that list that Paul gave us? Would you help us to come back from that? And God, would you help us as a community to fight for unity in this, to take a step, to listen and obey to the voice of your Spirit? God, I pray for the stories of life change and impact that are going to come because we were willing to take a step like this, not just for somebody else, but for ourselves as well. God, we love you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand and sing with us? And if you call Eastern Hills home, take that piece of paper, fill it out, and bring it to one of these boxes whenever you're ready.